Okay, so we're in here. Shock Exchange. I'm with Mr. Mitchell, of course, and this is Trump and the G. It's the Baltimore Bridge collapse, a Black Swan event, and it's sort of a misnomer to say bridge collapse because it got ran into by a tanker at high speed, so it wasn't like it just collapsed on its own. The Key Bridge has been there for decades, and I understand it actually survived the attack back in the 80s. A ship ran into it from like it lost propulsion like 600 yards away from the bridge and it hit the bridge at about 6 knots, and it survived. So I think this was a little different in that much further distance to go, and it was running. It was runaway. It's a runaway ship, at probably traveling 6, 7 times its normal speed. Like one of those movies. Imagine one of those movies with Keanu Reeves, what Speed, where you had a runaway bus and then you had a runaway ship, something. So anyway, so a couple days ago, a tanker ran into one of the beams, the Key Bridge in Baltimore, and the thing just collapsed like a toy, like it just collapsed into pieces. I don't think it was built to sustain a an accident like that. It probably if you probably couldn't have planned it better if you wanted to collapse the bridge. And I'm not, you know, I don't. I mean, I think people are recognizing that as well. But when I think of Black Swan, I think of like people in the financial markets talk about Black Swans events where like it can be so catastrophic that it have knock-on effects like a crash in the stock market, like 1987 crash in the stock market, and the government had to like react to that to keep the markets afloat and to not create a panic and stop these bankers from jumping out of 15-story buildings or 15-story windows because they had all their relatives in these stocks that had crashed. You think about like long-term capital management where the Federal Reserve stepped in to stop the contagion and stop it from hurting their counterparties like Goldman Sachs, Lehman, so on and so forth. The other Black Swan event was September 11th, and I was actually in the World Trade Center that day on September 11th, 2001. I was taking the PATH train out to Newark. I was working out in Newark. I would take a PATH train to Newark every morning, and I was there about 7:30 that morning. And then I was at work when the planes hit, but it basically shut down a lot of downtown New York. We went into wartime mode. A lot of traffic was shut down for a while we're trying to figure out if there were other terrorist attacks. But I was working on a deal at the time, working on a relocation company for this employee I was working for. And when I worked in corporate M&A, and we were buying it from Citigroup. We had agreed on the price. We had signed an agreement. The only thing we needed was to finish our due diligence. And the sale and purchase agreement was subject to the completion of our due diligence. We did our due diligence. We had these accountants put together a due diligence report. We went over with senior management and got all the issues priced into the deal. This is like maybe 2 weeks after we finished due diligence. We were ready to sign the deal, and Citigroup was dragging their feet. It seemed kind of weird. Like the guy who ran M&A at Citigroup or leading the deal, it was clear he didn't know what he was doing because he kept like arguing over like points that didn't really matter. He's trying to be like a tough deal guy, be a tough negotiator, but the points he was arguing about weren't really that important. And he kept dragging his feet, kept arguing. I couldn't figure out. It's like I couldn't figure out what he was doing and what, the guy clearly know what he was doing. He's trying to be a tough negotiator. And so about 6 weeks after we finished due diligence, we're still waiting to sign the deal. And guess what happened? September 11th happened.
Oh.
And in the sale and purchase agreement, you have a clause for like material adverse event that we can back out of the deal.
Act of God.
war, terrorist attack.
Yeah. Mm-hmm.
And we backed out. And all the economists were saying that the GDP is going to decline dramatically. It's going to go from positive growth to negative growth. It's going to decline. And we pointed out as a reason to back out of the deal, and we repriced the deal lower. Citigroup was crying, but it was their own fault. They kept dragging their feet. They dragged it out like 4, 5, 6 weeks longer than it had to have. And then September 11th happened, and we repriced the deal because the economists were saying we all knew that the economy was going to decline. Nobody knew how bad it would get, but it got really bad.
Yeah.
The GDP cratered, and that's what we mean by Black Swan event. Is the Baltimore Bridge accident a Black Swan event? I don't think we know yet. I don't think it's not going to be anywhere near as bad as September 11th, but it's going to cause some consternation for the economy, definitely for the Baltimore D.C. area.
Yeah.
So how you priced it in, we're going to try to just walk through high level the areas of the economy and areas that could be impacted by this collapse, and just trying to drill down on it to let the public know what could be next. So I'll let Mr. Mitchell weigh in on it. But there's also 6 people who lost their lives, which is pretty tragic.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sure our first reaction was probably the same as a lot of folks saw it for the first time. The way the bridge collapsed almost looked like something out of something out of Bad Boys film. I was trying to think of the director's name, forgot his name. That directed Bad Boys.
It wasn't Ridley Scott, was it?
No, not Ridley Scott. Gosh, blanking. I can kind of hear his name in my head, just on the tip of my tongue. But it looked like something out of action film. It almost didn't look real. Almost much like 9/11. Unfortunately, I was in boot camp when 9/11 happened. So watching watching towers go down on a replay, but it was just kind of heartbreaking because the immediate thought is, how many people are on that bridge, right? How many cars are on that bridge? How many families are on that bridge? Even how many children are traveling with their families that are on that bridge and may not have been able to survive and crash into the water, let alone the collapsing of hundreds of thousands of pounds of steel and wires and electricity kind of on top of them. So certainly my heart went out to all of those involved. I think the initial reports were 20 people and multiple vehicles, but they hadn't counted and so I think it was just maybe a few hours after it happened. So rescue crews and emergency and first responders are still identifying the true impact by how many folks were involved in the accident as a result. But beyond that, we've seen the mayor of Baltimore, I think, respond in an expected manner. Although, as an aside, he's been getting a significant amount of backlash because apparently, the fact that he showed up to a press conference at 2 a.m. in the morning to address his constituents and then just the greater public at large. But apparently, because he wasn't wearing a suit and he's wearing a Letterman's jacket, it got a lot of vitriol, a lot of roundabout ways of calling him the N-word, frankly. A lot of memes made about him, and it just really shows the that folks, we lack some humanity sometimes. And that just reminded me very quickly that irrespective of the lives that were impacted and lost, the thing that people choose to focus on is the fact that you have a black mayor addressing his constituents and doing it in a reassuring manner, in a straightforward manner. But we still get into these respectability politics because he's wearing a Letterman's jacket and not a suit and tie or something that non-black folks would deem respectable enough to uh, address the public at large at 2 a.m. in the morning. But that notwithstanding, one of the things I was really surprised by, and having spent a lot of time in Baltimore, school in Baltimore, um, and didn't realize that Key Bridge transports the most amount of vehicles in the country, nearly a million vehicles. Did not realize that. I think I probably would have assumed it was, it would be a New York bridge or maybe even Jersey with how many folks are on the turnpike going from Jersey to New York and vice versa. But it is certainly a black swan event in the sense that um, it's going to have ripple effects. I think J.P. Morgan as well as Oxford still calculating what some of those costs may be. So far, the response is that it's going to be minimal, but it's a strange way to describe a $2 million a day loss. That's to you can either call it second tier or middle market, depending on if you're coming from real estate lens. But because Baltimore is considered a middle market city, that for the last, I would argue, maybe about 15 years or so, has been always kind of up and coming. Even a few popular movies were made about it, and the gentrification of Baltimore was really a backstory to some of the films that have been made um, in Baltimore over the last over that same kind of 10 or 15 year period, where the harbor was built up, and I remember when they was really pouring money early, um, actually really from like the late 90s, but you really saw the effect in like the mid 2000s, where the harbor was really built up. Um, Even East Baltimore was starting to revamp. You were starting to see some revitalization efforts throughout East Baltimore, but the harbor was the gem of Baltimore. And, it would be a nice time driving up there, and especially from DC, depending on traffic, 40, 45 minute drive up to Baltimore. Um, the harbor had a lot of restaurants even then, and we'll have different events, and just that the whole harbor area. They wanted to make it more walkable, more welcoming, and that's really where the revitalization efforts and resources started. So the harbor, really since the mid 2000s, has been uh, the growth point for Baltimore. Um, so to call the effects minimal, I don't know how. you know, I think it just speaks to how so far removed some of these folks are, some of these banks are, when you're talking about a city whose median income is still below national average. So $2 million a day to that city, I would argue, is pretty significant. Pretty significant. Um, but yeah, I guess we'll get more into it. But those were my just kind of immediate thoughts about the tragedy in Baltimore.
Okay, thank you for that. Those are fair points. You hit. I mean, it's nuanced because if it doesn't happen in New York, then it's not important apparently.
Right,
Because
right,
anything that happens in New York is like a catastrophe, and stop tourism, and the government's got to bail everybody out. And the only people who can handle a crisis like this is Mayor Rudolph Giuliani.
right,
Because during
right.
September 11th, he was getting kudos for how quickly he reacted, and he did all this stuff and got resources to the city to help um, restore confidence and bring resources to New York after September 11th, where there was a crash in D.C. as well, and the mayor in D.C. at the time was black. I think it was Adrian Fenty, maybe. I know he
Yeah,
was
yeah,
African
yeah,
American. I know he was African American. He got no positive press, but
yeah.
Giuliani was getting all this
It's
positive
actually
press
Rihanna's
for,
cousin.
huh?
It's a little fun fact. Mayor Fenty is actually Rihanna's cousin.
Okay,
Yeah.
okay. But yeah, but you understand what I'm saying? Like,
Mhm.
Giuliani got all this praise from the media, and the mayor of DC got no praise for handling, navigating the financial crisis. And so you
Yeah.
have this black mayor in Baltimore who's getting criticized for not having an executive presence, and you knew it was coming.
Right.
You knew it was
Yeah.
coming. It was
Yeah.
coming. I don't think Wes Moore had a suit on either. The governor.
Right.
But
He did.
apparently, the mayor doesn't have an executive presence, and not someone you would see in a leadership position. People outside Baltimore may see in a leadership position, but you knew the criticism was coming, and
Yeah.
it's not going to stop. If he gets if the harbor returns in 2 years, they're going to say it should have been returning. It should return to normal in 1 year.
Right.
So the media is not going to let up. But anyway, so on that, I mean, they're saying, okay, so let's look at they're saying that the Baltimore Bridge, it carries, cars and heavy equipment. They're saying that it's the manufacturer is scrambling to, figure out where they're going to load or unload cargo while the main operations of the port are shut down. And apparently, it's the 11th biggest port in the U.S. and the country's
Yeah.
business for import and export of autos and light trucks. I think they can divert. They're going to divert imports and exports probably maybe to Philadelphia, Norfolk, Savannah, and Charleston. But it could take a while, and it could be more costly. I don't know if they're gonna increase the cost pass those costs on to consumers. There's a reason why they route trucks and light trucks and cars through the Baltimore port. I mean, the port in Baltimore. I'm not sure if they're gonna pass those costs on to consumers, or because time is money. It
Yeah.
could take a while to rewrite those trucks and light cars, and to maybe pass those costs on to consumers. Um, the other thing is that the insurance cost is saying could be anywhere from $2 to $4 billion. A lot of that's going to be some of that's going to be loss of life due to loss of life, and
Mm-hmm.
I'm not sure how much it's going to cost to repair the bridge. Like I said, I understand that the original bridge cost like $111 million to build.
Yeah. Yeah.
I know for a fact we can't build a bridge today for $111 million.
No.
And if we build, no matter what happens, it's going to be cost overruns, and it's not going to get finished on time. The cost of repairing this bridge, the cleanup and repairing the bridge, could probably be 6, 7 times that easily. And with all the technology that we put into to the infrastructure, who's to say that technology is going to work? Boeing can't build a plane that works anymore. They could build planes back in the 70s and 80s, but because of all the intricacies of the technology, if one part malfunctions, the rest of the plane could not operate properly. Boeing can't build a plane with the doors stay on. If you can believe that.
Yeah.
And I'm sure all the intricacies of the technology probably impacting that, but I don't think we can build a bridge like they built it back in 1970s when the Key Bridge was built, or when the San Francisco Golden Gate Bridge, or George Washington Bridge, the Brooklyn Bridge, Woodrow Wilson Bridge. These bridges probably couldn't be built today. We probably don't have the know-how, or the will to do it, because the more cost overruns more cost overruns. It means more money for the people who build the bridge. So I definitely know. I can say this for pretty much be certain of this, that the rebuilding of the Key Bridge will result in cost overruns and delays. It won't be built on time. It's going to cost probably billions more than it should. And if I'm the governor of Baltimore, Westmore, or I'm the mayor of Baltimore, I'm on the phone to Joe Biden right now, say that we need money to help fund the cost for rebuilding this bridge, and the federal government should kick in, because all the infrastructure shouldn't be borne by the state of Maryland, because so many people outside of Maryland utilize this bridge and utilize this Maryland infrastructure, because it's located in that corridor between Washington, D.C., Philadelphia, New York, Boston, that corridor, Charlotte, Atlanta, especially with the Mid-Atlantic states. That's an important location. And the infrastructure has to work for business to take place between those different major cities. You look at along that, from the Mid-Atlantic states to New England, you got Charlotte, Washington, D.C., Baltimore, Camden, New York, Philadelphia, Newark, Hartford, Boston, Providence. That's how important 95 is. So if I'm on the phone to the governor right now, Joe Biden, to the president right now, saying we need funding to help with the cleanup and help rebuild this bridge, and they're gonna get the money because it's an election year. And I think it's gonna be one of those points where, like, the rising cost of healthcare was back when, in 2016, when Hillary was running against Trump, and also I can't think, Bernie Sanders. They were all arguing over the rising cost of healthcare. And anybody who was creating, people looking at Gilead, they were looking at Valiant, they were looking at Shirley Farmer Bro.
Yeah.
And so it's going to become an election issue. I'm on the phone to Joe Biden right now if I'm Westmore, and if I'm the mayor of Baltimore. And they're going to get the money too.
Yeah, to that point, Biden administration already came out and pretty much stated that the federal government is going to front the bill. It falls within the emergency powers of Congress, as well as within the budget, more importantly. So even at that, let's call it 5-6x the cost, so $100 million in 1970s. Let's call it closer to $5 billion today, maybe even a little more given the time it takes, because I think, like, one of the things that was really learned in the coverage with the opioid crisis is just how broke and nearly bankrupt a lot of our states are. It's only a few short years ago that, settlements really began to come through with the AGs. So in other words, I don't have any confidence that, since 2022, that states are all of a sudden flush with surplus cash. And least of all, Maryland, and drilling down deeper, least of all, Baltimore. Baltimore still has a significant high poverty rate, still has some of the worst, especially for Black students, worse testing scores throughout the country, worse performance in schools. That is a direct reflection of the use of tax allocation, as well as the amount of tax allocation. It has endured over the last decade scandal after scandal, sweeping through an entire police force, including commissioner on down. including mayor on down. Baltimore over the last 2 decades uh, has been through a lot. The 08, 09 financial crisis, in a lot of ways, Baltimore is still recovering. Baltimore has never recouped back to, again, as I stated earlier, really like mid 2000s. So if you want to say like 04, 05, even DC was starting to uh, kind of build its harbor as well. But I think technically that's still considered Maryland. Um, but the point is that around that time, the country was flush. Remember we're coming off of, we're coming off of the Clinton administration, where the country was in a surplus. We're still in the first term of Bush. 9/11 happens. We're already post-dot-com bubble, but uh, the country itself was still at a surplus, uh, and that's where the housing bubble was arguably um, swelling the most. I still remember being in DC. Everyone and their grandmother, literally their grandmothers, were flipping houses. You end up flipping houses almost inadvertently because you could truly buy. It was truly, a once in a lifetime phenomenon to be in it, and certainly from my lens, did not realize what was happening. Where you could literally buy a home on Tuesday, not do anything to it, not put one single dime in that house, to renovate or do any sort of improvement to the home. And on Thursday, that home is worth 5 to 10% more. And that was hard to pass up when, you're surrounded by folks that are, saving up money to buy a home. They buy a home, and then, the home 2 weeks later is up, 10%. And then they end up selling the home and then doing it again 3 or 4 more times. This was the environment, in other words. And Baltimore was a part of that upswing during that time. So you saw a lot of massive improvements happening really between like 03, 04, and 2007, 2008. So when the housing crash finally happens, the entire country takes a hit. You're talking about on average 30%, places like DC, where the hit was not felt as much. The average for DC in terms of home value was about 10%. But anyone that has been to DC and Baltimore, you know that although it's a 40-minute drive on the 270, it is a vastly different world. DC is almost nothing like Baltimore. You're talking about different income levels, different job types. Baltimore is largely a blue collar city. It would be more likened to Philly if you had to give it a comparison, versus DC, where it's largely driven by military, government, and healthcare. So, and not just those industries, but the pinnacle of those industries. If you're a government worker or you're an NGO worker, you spend 10, 15 years getting to a senior leadership position. And where do you end up? DC. So, in other words, DC, when you look at median income for DC, especially mid 2000s, median income was sitting at about 90K, whereas Baltimore was sitting at about 45K. So, in other words, Baltimore has seen over the last 2 decades, um, struggle after struggle, very short period of an upswing. So, Baltimore is in zero position to foot the bill on this bridge collapse, which is the point that I was ultimately making. Federal government has to step in. The tax base is just not there to support such a project. You would almost have to put the city of Baltimore on austerity in order to be able to pay for the bridge, and they probably still would run out of money. So, federal government absolutely has to front the bill for this, and the length of time, is anyone's guess. I would argue to say that even just the RFP, the request for proposal process for this bridge, is probably going to take a year, maybe even a little more, unless there is a fire uh, under the federal government and really pushing for efficiency. But one thing that we will not see is efficiency in pricing. I mean, we're still paying $3,000 for toilet seats
I
um,
got you.
in the federal government. So, this is certainly going to be bloated. And I would argue to say, yeah, we probably are going to be looking at a $4 to $6 billion price tag when it's all said and done.
Yeah, it's gonna be efficiency up until the election in terms of
Yeah,
coming up with a plan. And after the election, things would probably slow down. But um, you can't compare Baltimore to like people. A lot of people who live in Washington D.C., L.A., or maybe New York, for instance, they can't understand. They have no idea what it's like to live in other cities because a lot of these places are destination cities. They're big on tourism, and the federal government politicians are highly attuned to what happens in New York, D.C., and like L.A. Like
right,
for instance, if all the majority of the lion's share of bailout money after September, after the financial crisis or mid the financial crisis went to New York. They hadn't bailed
right,
out those banks, the lights in New York City wouldn't have come on.
right.
And they get this favorite city status, and people just don't understand how they kind of like get so much support from the federal government. But places like Newark, Camden, New Jersey, Baltimore, Maryland, Bridgeport, Connecticut, Gary, Indiana. These were major working class cities. And a lot of those jobs when they went to, when someone went down south, when they went overseas, it decimated those cities. Like when Campbell's Soup left Camden, it
Yeah,
decimated Camden. When there was a place called Sparrows Point where a lot of African Americans worked. A black man you go out, come out of high school and work your way into middle class status. When that folded, it hurt Baltimore pretty badly. When the harbor, and so the revitalization of the harbor, was a major point for Baltimore to bring those jobs back. Again, they have Amazon there, and Amazon may have to either reroute packages or people may not get their packages may not get next day delivery. So it's a big win to bring Amazon to that area. Um, a bigger picture is that people have been saying that people like Paul Krugman have been saying, "Oh, the economy is strong." Like you said, people who live in Baltimore aren't flush with cash, but investment bankers, hedge fund managers, private equity firms, they're flush with cash. And so now we're going to see just how weak the economy really is for working class people. That when the government has to foot the bill to repair the bridge and maybe knock on effects of the loss of the bridge, and then you have the stress put on the federal government, the other the declines in the economy around Baltimore and Washington D.C. area. You have loss of tourism in Baltimore. The harbor is a big place for tourism, big place for restaurants. The restaurants may not be able to serve people for a while until that harbor gets restored. I mean, who wants to eat a crab cake now out of the harbor?
right,
You know what I mean?
right.
Who wants to eat seafood
Mm-hmm.
now? And so it's almost like a catch 22, and it's the story of Baltimore, the story of the return of the harbor or the economic activity around the harbor. Now it's been sort of damaged. Now it has an outsized impact on the city of Baltimore. Can you imagine the traffic going through Baltimore and the DC area now? Because I understand that bridge helped people get to 95 without going through Baltimore. And they probably have to go through Baltimore to get to 95. So traffic jams. It's a it's a inconvenience for individuals. But you can imagine if you're a trucker having
Yeah.
to travel
Oh,
through that throughway,
yep.
how much it impacts business. So you have I know on the cruise line saying their earnings are gonna decline because of the port shut down.
Hmm.
About 2,400 workers, union workers, are afraid they're gonna lose their jobs. And then you have the knock-on effects of all that. That when port workers lose their jobs, cruise ships aren't flowing through Baltimore, has knock-on effects because other people rely on that business. If you're in the restaurant business, if you have a barber shop or you have a beauty salon or whatever small business you have, a lot of it's dependent upon that steady flow of customers who work in around the harbor. So I think
And
you're gonna see. I think we're gonna test whether Paul Krugman's really right that because the stock market is at 40,000, the Dow's at 40,000, that the economy's strong, and because hedge fund managers are doing pretty well, that the economy's strong. We're gonna see. We're gonna test that theory now.
well,
And I
it's
guess, and you just can't
yeah,
say people in Baltimore should have been hedge fund managers. That can't be your solution.
right. I mean, I think we're going to see kind of two phenomenon competing at the same time because one of the points you brought up earlier, um, essentially the importance of the Northeast corridor. Um, so even when you look at essentially the most valuable corridor in the country, it is unequivocally the Northeast corridor, and that covers everything, really from Boston. Um, sure, geographically you can go from Maine to Florida, but one of the ways to kind of track how commerce flows is you look at the railroads, right? And essentially, the most important stops are really between Boston, Boston and Virginia. So that Northeast corridor, Amtrak runs on many of the, uh, CSX and other carrier trains, railroads run along. Um, I think because of the importance of that, and Baltimore is on that within that Northeast corridor, and such a significant piece that one of the things I think you probably will see from business leaders and alike, the lobbying. So I think maybe that's one thing that Baltimore will have in its favor is that you may get an Amazon lobbying, you may get railroads lobbying, you may get other unions, and like I said, business leaders and executives lobbying um, to make sure that the government is not stalling out, make sure politicians are, dragging their feet on emergency votes, getting funding together, and making sure that the RFP process also remains efficient to where the work can start, because that's really arguably the only part of the process where one has to take kind of take their time. But then the other kind of competing force is just like you stated, the knock-on effects, right? The significant amount of small businesses that rely on that foot traffic, rely on the commerce that travels through Baltimore,
Yeah,
and
if you're a restaurant, you're a small business, you may rely on lunchtime traffic for some of those people,
right,
from some of those union workers. That may have
absolutely,
been your whole business model.
absolutely, it's and one of the things that uh, the COVID exposed. AP News did a report, and then you saw New York Times, other outlets, essentially parrot the uh, same results. Is that about 60% of all Black-owned businesses shuttered during COVID? Of that 60%, about 80% of them were denied for PPP loans. Meanwhile, how many folks have been now caught, convicted of, PPP fraud, where, they've gotten literally millions. I think the worst case that I saw was nearly $20 million in PPP loan funding, and they didn't even have a business. None of those folks were black. And that's the crazy part, that they didn't even have businesses and were able to defraud the government. Meanwhile, you have hardworking business owners putting up their own capital to try to, as they're told to do, pull themselves up by their own bootstraps. And they're no different than the big three auto industry, with the exception of Ford, but Chrysler and GM certainly went shaking their tin can to the government for TARP funds. The banks were shaking their tin can to the government, and they certainly weren't pulling themselves up by the bootstraps, unless you consider taking cash out of taxpayers' pockets as pulling yourself up by the bootstraps. Meanwhile, the folks that are actually pulling themselves up by their own bootstraps, they were denied. And if folks don't know, the average size loans that PPP were issuing out were less than $40,000. That even on a small business that's doing $1 million a year in revenue, $40,000 does barely covers a month's worth of expenses after payroll, insurance, vendors, etc. So my point is that, how will the federal government, because it's one thing to fund the bridge, but it's another thing what is going to happen to the subsequent businesses that were supporting that ecosystem that relied on the business that was coming from the bridge. And especially during the time where we are in this is stagflation. Jerome Powell can change. We literally said it here. I specifically said it on record 6 months before it happened. The only way that we are not going to be in a recession is if the Fed changes the definition of recession. And 6 months later, what did the Fed do? Literally change the definition of recession in order to fit their needs. So, irrespective of what the economic data that the Fed decides to cherry pick in order to avoid saying that we are in a recession, if they can't face that this country is in a recession, then I certainly have no confidence that they're going to admit we're also in stagflation at this point. You can't have a market that is essentially melting up. Meanwhile, inflation is also shooting up. Because if you look at real rate of inflation, beyond the cherry picking that the Fed does, you're still looking at closer to about 8.3%. Uh, and the Fed can't print the difference between, for I think our viewers that may not understand that distinction between, depression and stagflation is interest. It's inflation. That's the biggest difference. And inflation, when inflation is up, that means that the Fed cannot print its way out of out of a bad economy, because when interest rates are already sky high, inflation is already sky high. The more you print, then now we're going to be looking at Zimbabwe situation, Venezuela situation, Germany World War II situation. We're going to be looking at hyperinflation. So, in other words, what is going to happen to this ecosystem within Baltimore that relies on the business from everyone crossing the bridge, and essentially the commerce? Will they be able to survive during the time that the bridge is being built? I think that's the
Okay.
bigger question for me.
Yeah, the other thing is that you have big business coming in trying to, where Baltimore wasn't a place of interest. All of a sudden, you have big business infrastructure funds going to probably come in and try to make the lion's share of the money. How much of that stays in Baltimore, who knows? But the other thing I forgot to mention was CSX. Well, not just CSX, but a lot of coal exports go through Baltimore, and then the owner of the Baltimore Orioles was talking about leaving Baltimore unless they, I guess, gave him another stadium or whatever. And that stadium that they built back in the early '90s was considered to be a model stadium, like
Right.
very quaint. And
Mhm.
other stadiums like Philadelphia, like not Philadelphia, but Pittsburgh Pirates modeled their stadiums after the Baltimore Orioles. And that helped revitalize the harbor area. But if he wanted to leave beforehand, I'm sure guaranteed he wants to leave now. And you after this event, because it's not going to improve. The situation's not going to improve after this event. And you may have people who may want to leave Baltimore looking for work. Quickly, Mr. Mitchell. A lot of people say Black Swan event. They mean terrorist attack, and I've heard a lot of people online talking about this must be a terrorist attack. It looked like it was on purpose. Could you just, what are your thoughts on that? Is it or it's overblown or just too early to tell?
I mean, so my knee jerk reaction is that it's overblown. For decades, it is no secret that America's infrastructure is crumbling. It's largely lagging behind. When we look at even second tier cities throughout China, even New York should be embarrassed of its infrastructure. Even the metro alone, between DC has tried to sell his metro no less than 4 times. um, there was even talks of potentially selling MTA because the cost of maintaining MTA, let alone putting in improvements, when I think the original ridership of New York subway was supposed to be something like a million, a million folks a day, and we have the equivalent of about 5 to 10 million riders every day because of the population growth. So it's no secret that you know America's infrastructure is also susceptible to attacks, right? Um, it's been printed over the last 3 decades. So, is there a possibility that this, could have been a test, right? One of those test scenarios. Um, you have entire departments throughout the military and the government that essentially run with different scenarios and in order to create emergency disaster preparedness plans. Um, and could this be one of those scenarios that ended up, kind of falling through the cracks because we were unprepared to deal with it? Um, I don't know. My gut is just telling me that this is truly what it looked like. An aging ship that lost power. Um, I'm not a ship expert. I'm sure that those folks are already all over CNN to discuss what the ship should have done as opposed to what it actually did. Um, so I leave a little bit of room, but for some reason my gut is just telling me that this is exactly what it looks like on its face, and it just exposes uh, how poorly our infrastructure uh, truly is aging. We do not keep up with maintenance the way that we should, which then goes right back into the conversation that we always have, the economics of it.
Right.
Right? We're in stagflation. Where is the money going to come from? We're uh, I think what was it? Larry Fink just put out a warning. It just issued a warning a couple of days ago to Congress, saying every 100 days we're looking at an increase of debt of $2 trillion. So if you got the largest asset manager on the planet and the head of the largest asset manager on the planet, uh, who somehow has grown, from $8 trillion in assets during a pandemic to closer to $15 trillion in assets, while also sounding the alarm that we should do something about the economy, which is a different rabbit hole. But somehow he's issuing warnings to Congress, but he's also not wrong either. Right. So, in other words, where does that money come from in order to upgrade the infrastructure of the U.S.? So I
Okay.
just think it is what it is on its face. I think it's an accident.
Right.
Um,
So that's what it looks like. And like I said earlier, there was an accident on that bridge back in the '80s where a ship lost propulsion, and it ran into the bridge at like maybe 6 knots or whatever from like 600 yards away. I guess the question remains: should these ships that's going through this harbor, now that we know what type of disaster they can cause, maybe they should be upgraded before they allow. They should have some type of maintenance or some type of checks before they allowed to go into the harbor or around these bridges. Now that we know what type of problem they could cause. I mean, your ship lose propulsion. You know, you didn't have a. I mean, I know that's it's going to cost more capital expenditures for these shipbuilders or for these shipping companies, but that's you can't have a ship cause this much damage.
yeah,
And not wonder like I mean that you have to it could have been. I'm not saying I mean things happen, but accidents happen, but why you have these aging ships going through these harbors or through these around these ports that could cause this type of damage because somebody's too cheap to invest in capital expenditures or put new ships in there. No different from the mining companies who don't want to invest in more safety equipment or improve their safety records. I mean that's another question nobody's asking. But as far as the terrorist attacks, I think it's just a knee jerk reaction. People just saying stuff with no evidence, and I'm sure we're going to get to the bottom of it. The bigger picture is that all this money printing that's been going to the investor class, Goldman Sachs and Morgan Stanley are not the economy. Hedge fund managers are not the economy, and we've been saying it for years. So now we're gonna soon find out that the economy is still weak after all this money printing because it's not economically sound just to print money and give it to your donors or somebody you want to date or somebody who you want to work for when you leave office. So that's sort of my high level take. The other thing is, unlike September 11th, nobody's really coming out with adjustments down for GDP. I'm not sure they really know yet. I'm not sure people have connected those dots as
hmm
far as how much the U.S. economy could decline because of this, because of more printing of money, more aid to Baltimore, um, just like aid to banks. Without the aid to banks, the economy would have sank by now. So I'm not sure people really connect those dots as far as how much this could impact GDP, and that to me would be whether this is a black swan event or not. So that's basically it. Unless you have anything else, Mr. Mitchell, you want
Oh,
to
that's
add?
it for me.
Okay, so that's Trump and the GE. Is Baltimore Bridge collapse a black swan event? Thank you for listening. Thank you.
Right.
Okay, I think you got to hold on for like a